Uh, hi to my welcome to this discussion on the future of technology supply chains. I'm Jordan Small, Executive Director here at the NZ-US Council. We have a great topic, awesome panel, and I think I've been quite excited about this discussion. So that's all ahead of us. It's a really, really tight schedule, just 60 minutes to cover this massive topic, try to understand what decoupling is and make sense of what this all means for our tech businesses and for New Zealand in general. For those who registered before yesterday afternoon, you should have received an email from me with a link to our panelists' bios. Ruben Steff's paper, The Great Disconnect, US-China Technology Decoupling and its Implications for New Zealand. I've already included the links to these documents in the chat function if you didn't receive that email. Ruben's paper will serve as a useful starting point for today's discussions. And I know Ruben has written the paper to encourage debate and disagreement, and hopefully at the end of that, for business and government to be thinking about planning towards these future states. So really quite excited to hear from industry voices today, in particular, and how they're seeing decoupling and how it's a very real consideration for them right now and how they operate their businesses. Also interested to hear from them on how they see it playing out. And then a US perspective. So we have Ainiki Raikkonen from DC think tank CNAS, and she'll be providing an update on US technology policy and US tech alliance thinking at the moment. And then of course, importantly, we want to hear from you. And so your comments, your questions, use the Q&A function, use the chat function. And David Capey, who will be facilitating the discussion, will pick them up as we move through the session. So at this point, and not to take up any more time, I want to hand it over to David. He is the go-to source of info on international relations. He's a prolific tweeter on these matters and just a thoroughly nice guy. David, welcome and thank you for taking on this task.
Jordan, thanks very much and good morning and welcome. Very great, lovely to see so many people of you joining us online for, as Jordan said, what I think is a really exciting topic and one that's, I think, provoking a lot of discussion and consideration at the moment. As Jordan said, the bios of our four speakers have been circulated, so I'm not going to go over the details and talk about their august and extensive achievements in great detail. But as Jordan mentioned, we've got four terrific speakers from academia, from think tankery, and from industry. We've got Ruben Steff, a senior lecturer in political science at University of Waikato and the author of this paper that's been circulated. Ainiki Raikkonen is a research associate in the Technology and National Security Program at CNAS in Washington. Our two speakers from industry are Anna Kalmanik, the Asia Pacific Region Director for WISC Limited, which is an urban autonomous air mobility company established as a joint venture between Boeing and Kitty Hawk. And fourthly, but certainly not least, Stuart Wilson, CEO and co-owner of Endace, a cybersecurity focused company providing componentry for intelligence infrastructure across the world. So a terrific spectrum of perspectives that we're going to hear. Ruben, I wonder if I can start with you. You've written this paper, and obviously people who'll be joining us, some will be more or less familiar with this concept of decoupling. Can you maybe just give us a bit of an introductory context to decoupling, and also talk a little bit about the purpose of the paper that you've put forward and some of the scenarios that you've identified?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. And thanks everyone else for coming today. Kia ora, good morning and good evening, wherever you're from, whatever the time is. So yeah, decoupling refers to the breakdown of the relevant tech supply chain systems in the world into increasingly separate systems, systems that serve potentially a kind of US-led bloc or a Chinese-led bloc. It involves a range of things. It's the severing of tech supply chains from China or perhaps US-connected entities, industrial policies and market interventions, and export controls on key technological inputs. Now, the reason we wrote this, as Jordan kind of mentioned, is the paper is to get us to think about US-China tech decoupling, what it means for New Zealand, our tech sector, businesses, government, and society writ large. We think it's timely because the global economy is facing some significant challenges. Firstly, we have COVID, which has exposed supply chain vulnerabilities, and at the same time, also increased New Zealand's reliance on technology. For example, according to some estimates, our tech industry brought in between $12 to $13 billion in the past year, with the US being far and away our largest export market in this area. By 2030, the tech industry in New Zealand actually hopes to be our largest export market. It wants to overtake agriculture. The second challenge to the global economy, of course, does come down to these geopolitical tensions between the US and China that is leading them to enact these tech decoupling policies. And outlets like Eurasia Group have said this great technological decoupling is the single most significant geopolitical development since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there could be some difficult decisions that lie ahead for countries like New Zealand. So to grapple with these issues, in the paper, we've taken a scenarios approach. This has kind of the benefit of allowing us to consider a range of different realities and what that may mean for New Zealand, from essentially the status quo all the way through to a full-blown technological Cold War. And I'll touch upon the scenarios in a moment, but I'll just say, we are seeing this decoupling across a whole range of technological products and sectors. It includes things like semiconductors, the most fundamental componentry for digital devices, laptops, and everything. It's also about 5G telecommunications, given 5G is going to set a baseline for how nations essentially operate in the years to come. So we have short case studies in the paper on semiconductors and 5G to show how decoupling is playing out right now in the world today on these issues. And this decoupling seems to be about the US and China seeking control and access to data and related advanced and emerging technologies. Collectively, the belief is that all of this will empower the organizations and nations that can best harness and integrate data and emerging technologies in the most innovative ways. It's also about Washington and Beijing having a philosophical disagreement over tech governance and the politics of the internet, with democracies essentially promoting more open systems and the free flow of information, and autocracies seeking greater control of information and essentially more closed systems, or systems that they can better control themselves, control the flow of information and what information and ideas are shared within their nations and potentially globally. So briefly on the scenarios, we have 3 scenarios, each of which have a core set of characteristics that dial up across each of the 3 scenarios. So scenario 1 is essentially an intensification of the status quo, which is where we seem to be headed right now. It's a world of relatively still high levels of global supply chain integration, except on key sensitive technology areas. We think in this scenario, the impacts are reasonably well contained to the specific key technology components, but businesses in countries like New Zealand are still able to operate relatively freely in both the US and Chinese markets. And I'll be interested to hear from our industry panelists soon if that's what they're seeing. The second scenario dials that up to be a highly competitive world, but not yet a full-blown kind of Cold War world, if you will. In this world, the list of sensitive tech areas grows. But the difference between this scenario and scenario 3 is that third-party nations are still able to fairly largely operate in the US and Chinese markets. The third worst case scenario is a technological Cold War. Here we would find, with rare exceptions, there'd be 2 block-aligned supply chains emerging, a US allied supply chain, if you will, and a Chinese allied supply chain. This would have, very serious implications for countries like New Zealand to effectively pick a side, and in picking one side would be locked out from that other trading block or supply chain block, if you will. So in the paper, we offer commentary on each of the scenarios and the implications. We look at restrictions that the US and China would apply across each of them. We consider the different levels of cybersecurity risk, and what multilateral rules would exist at the UN and other international fora. And obviously, if you get to that Cold War third scenarios, there's going to be no real international rules or regulations to speak of, outside of perhaps some kind of weak understanding. Finally, we end the paper by posing some key questions that we hope will prompt further thought and discussion on these issues. So look, I'll leave things there because I really want to hear from our panelists. Please do check out the paper when you have time. We very much welcome feedback. And yeah, just keen to hear what the other panelists think on all these issues. So thanks for listening to everyone.
Thanks very much, Ruben. That's terrific. And thanks for keeping so responsibly to time, which is a rare thing these days. We'll come back to some of those questions that you've posed, particularly in terms of how these scenarios are already being felt for, or some of the projections you've painted are being felt for industry when we talk to Anna and Stuart a little bit later. I wonder if I could turn to Ainiki though and ask you. Obviously, US-China policy is, we've seen some clear signals, but still some of the details are a work in progress. But you've been working on technology policy and technology alliances for a while now. Where do you think, where's this thinking at within the administration? And perhaps how do you see the scenarios that Ruben's talked about? How do they sit with the sort of thinking that you're seeing in Washington?
Certainly. And first of all, thank you for hosting. Thanks to our audience for being here. I think on the multilateral front, I would speculate that it's really the bedrock of what a US approach might look like going forward. I think in the last couple of years, as you've seen technology sort of come to the center of thinking in US foreign policy, it began with this kind of, I think, overcorrection in some ways that was a little bit ad hoc, such as implementing export controls without doing multilateral consultations, sort of banning companies left and right. But I think there's been this acknowledgement that the United States really can't go it alone. When we think about supply chains and the tech ecosystem writ large, it is just too large, it's too interconnected, and the stakeholders involved, it's other nation states as well, but then also looking at standard setting bodies, some of these non-governmental institutions that might be facing new interference from Beijing in a state-backed fashion. And so I think when US policymakers are addressing the challenge, there's this shift from this ad hoc approach to something that is a little bit more inclusive of different countries, of the private industry, and also some of these bodies that are sort of not usually within the realm of geopolitical contest.
What are the sectors? So far, you mentioned a number of areas where the administration, the previous administration in particular, used export controls and bans, as you put it, left and right quite quickly. Looking at the way that the Biden administration is starting to approach this in a more systematic approach and perhaps thinking multilaterally, where are the sectors where you see particular attention, a particular focus?
Yes, I think we're seeing a little bit of a thematic way of thinking about technology, which for me as a conceptual person, is really lovely to think about, but thinking about, what surveillance technology and human rights, how they interact is one. 5G is one I think that in some ways stands alone. Looking at what technologies are considered foundational and what are the parts that go into them. And so, for instance, artificial intelligence is something that you insert into many things. So are semiconductors. And then data, obviously, is one area that sticks into all of these other technologies too. And so, I think it's not necessarily about picking and choosing industries so much as understanding the ecology of technologies themselves and understanding how to pull on all the threads that sort of feed into them.
And thinking about this from a New Zealand perspective, what do you see as the sort of the options? Sometimes this is presented very much as a sort of stark black or white choice, go one way or another. What do you think the options are going to be for sort of third country parties as some of these frameworks start to materialize and be fleshed out?
Right. I certainly have a bias towards the US perspective, as you might imagine. So I'm very hesitant to frame this, potential decoupling as strictly a US versus China contest in the international sense. I think companies around the world are independently of the contest, sort of coming to realize that the business environment in China, domestically speaking, is becoming more challenging as the Communist Party strengthens its control over the technology sector, starts to impose more and more regulations, and seems to be getting very adept at having its way. And so, I think I'm hoping that there will be a shared recognition that maybe we do need to look at places that are becoming areas of contest, like standard setting bodies, or like looking at sort of oversized industrial policies and thinking about broadly for everyone, what does a more open and inclusive and fair marketplace look like? And so it's not just US versus China, but even what does the playing field look like for anybody?
Aniki, I read one of your papers online the other day, and I was struck by this point that you made, that on the one hand, there's this desire here to prevent domination by autocratic states in some of these emerging tech areas. There's real issues around surveillance and the protection of data. But there's also a danger here, it seems, that some of this can start to bleed into industrial policy or protectionism that can sort of impede creativity. How do you think those sorts of challenges are playing out?
That's a great question. I think in the long history, well, perhaps not that long, but reasonably long history of the US government, there's been a really strong allergy to talking about industrial policy at all. And so we're just starting to see these conversations emerge. But I think there is a recognition that a totally hands-off approach is perhaps not a sustainable way forward, given that I think on the one hand, the US government's ability to understand an adversary and the way they might be, I suppose, abusing certain sectors or technologies in ways that are, bad for human rights, for instance, or understanding that one tech company cannot overcome an entire other company's industrial policy that leans on subsidies that might have some component of interfering in otherwise technically based processes, and so on and so forth. And so, I think going forward, the US government is unlikely to overreach into the private sector. Certainly domestically, I think that would be unpopular, but I think going forward, it'll be about what is finding the right balance, where are the right places to give support, and then also looking multilaterally, how can we integrate a US approach into one that takes on our allies and partners as well.
Thanks, Aniki. That's really terrific. That's really helpful. I wonder if I can maybe turn to our two industry representatives now. Anna, you're an urban autonomous air mobility company, as we can see from that spectacular plane sitting behind you. You're in the tech innovation space. How are you starting to see these tensions playing out? What are you starting to see in terms of restrictions or export controls or complications in the way that WISC is doing business?
Yeah, look, I actually think the aerospace industry as a whole, which includes obviously advanced air mobility, which is the little section that we're in, is actually reflecting those sort of geopolitical and macroeconomic shifts in entirety. For more than 100 years, the US has dominated the aerospace industry and aviation. And now what we're really seeing is an increase in China, South Korea, and Germany really starting to pace in that area. So we are seeing some real shifts in the activity and how different governments are actually approaching that. In terms of the US and China dynamic, what we're observing is, for our own company, for example, it's really important that we're resilient in our supply chain, that we make sure that we aren't impacted by potential restrictions around ability to actually resource or source raw materials. And also, just watching in from a communications perspective, because obviously we're autonomous, that has a major impact on our sort of certification and how we're actually developing the aircraft. So what we're observing is that a number of companies that are approaching it from a dual strategy perspective. So they have a US-centric market perspective, and they have a China-Asia centric perspective. Both of those markets are significant. So, the complexity and the added cost that creates is still worth it, whether it be automotive or aircraft, aerospace. But it does create a complexity and a different way of operating. And, I guess my question for everybody is, does this redefine globalization? We haven't got necessarily the same sort of porous, way of operating that we once did. It is changing. And, as we're discussing today, what does that mean for all of us?
And I'm just listening to Ainiki talking about the ideas around regulation and some of these multilateral approaches, as somebody who's working in this from a business perspective, what are the things that are important for you as some of these new frameworks roll out? What are the, is it about predictability? Is it, what are you hoping to see?
Yeah, so I think policy and regulation really sit underneath all of this. So, you know, if we're thinking about actually how we're developing international policy, international regulations, particularly obviously in aviation and aerospace, there's a lot of regulation that determines certification and where we can fly and how we can fly. So that for us is a significant area of focus, of making sure that those regulations are truly international, that everybody is involved, and that, you know, the data that backs that up is actually robust, so that we have a similar approach to collecting data and building those standards and those regulations based on that data.
In your remarks, you talked about how a number of big firms are using this dual strategy approach, and I think one that's been talked about a little bit is Tesla, for example, which is a sort of, you know, is a pretty high profile example. In your case, or perhaps, do you think there's going to be a point where a dual strategy approach becomes much more challenging, or do you just see it as being sustainable going forward? What might be some of the complications with that going forward?
I think some of the complications will be around certification and to make sure that aircraft certification, so we're talking about an entirely new aircraft behind me. It's electric, it's vertical takeoff and landing, it's not been certified anywhere in the world. So, you know, actually having consistency around that certification is really important from a safety perspective, but also from an operational perspective. So, you know, there is going to be a point at the moment, you know, China has its own regulatory environment. It's, you know, including that in the conversations around international regulation and international certification is going to be vital if we're going to have a consistency across the globe in terms of the safety and reliability of these sorts of aircraft. So it's not to say that one is better than the other, it's just to actually be consistent, as you've said, but also to know what we're expected to deliver to and the standard of that, and so that the public also has confidence in that.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Anna. Stuart, I wonder if we can talk to you. You're in a different kind of business, and the cybersecurity business is obviously right on the front lines of some of these US-China tensions, and it is getting a lot of attention. What are you seeing in playing out in this space, and what does it mean for your business?
Yeah, we're in an interesting intersection in that we provide cyber defense solutions to, you know, really big network operators, and we build hardware, design and build hardware as well. So we're affected by supply chain. So we're in a very interesting intersection. And today I wanted to, there's a very broad topic, so I wanted to focus pretty much on silicon supply chain, just so we could kind of tease that one out. And just in general, what we're seeing is we're now, in the past, we could forecast 3 months in advance. We're now having to forecast 12 months in advance. So there's just the supply chain crunch is affecting us that way. Like companies like Tesla, we're having to design alternate designs so we have diversity on the supply chain front. What we're seeing in the marketplace is a lot of state-based actors and large silicon consumers placing really big orders on the silicon supply chain, and that's essentially swallowed up most of the silicon supply chain, and that's causing a great deal of concern. And that's backed up with logistics as well. That's becoming difficult. So we're seeing what we're seeing in the silicon marketplace is that reinforcing more generic components. So a lot of these smaller silicon manufacturers, specialist manufacturers are being squeezed out of the market. And it's really forcing the market to much more volume generic parts. One of the big things that's happening on the entire supply chain is everyone is now asking for NCNR, non-cancelable, non-refundable orders 12 months in advance. And I'll talk about it later, but I think that's putting in place a huge capital bubble in place in the supply chain. And it's interesting to talk about what's going to happen when the supply chain relaxes and that capital has to be found. What are we doing about it at Endace? We're spending a lot of our days now, whereas before it was easy, we'd just outsource production and place forecasts for 3 months in advance. We're now picking apart our designs, and we're basically grading components inside our designs based on supply chain severity, and we're building alternate designs so we have diversity, but we're also looking all the way down through into supply chain on those critical parts and shoring up components. In the past, we would just assume they'd arrive just in time. Now we're actually moved to a position where we want to know absolutely, we can actually see those parts on our shelves in order to guarantee supply, anything up to 9 months in advance, because we can see it's going to be an issue. So a lot more energy in terms of fine-grained control. And of course, the reason we go to component kind of management rather than finished goods management is that stretches our capital so much further by taking that step. Of course, those NCNR orders are one thing we have to kind of hedge against as well. So we're constantly balancing this long-term capital commit against the fact that it's NCNR, non-cancelable, non-refundable. The good news for Kiwi companies, I think, is Kiwi companies are very nimble, and we don't have vast supply chain volumes. We have good supply chain volumes, but not vast. We're very nimble. So far, we're pretty good. I can't say it's easy. It's really tough at the moment. We have to constantly pay attention to it. But I think we're in a pretty good position as a company, but only through lots of effort and capital commitment. Just a quick word on what we see as driving these issues in the marketplace. I think this discussion about US-China divide on silicon, a lot of people think that's recent. I personally see evidence of that happening over the last decade. So I think this has been brewing for a long time. And I think on the logistics supply chain, I think the logistics supply chain has been running at near capacity for quite some time. And almost like linear flow, it's been very efficient because everything's kept moving. I think what's happened both on the silicon side and on the supply logistics side is COVID's been a catalyst that's thrown a curveball into both. It's like an acid etch, which has exposed these underlying weaknesses in the silicon divide between East and West, as well as the shipping logistics. And it's kind of like almost like a perfect storm. It's almost like everything's gone into turbulent mode rather than laminar flow. Yeah, so it's even become more or less efficient, which is just making it harder to get out of. I think in Ruben's report, I noticed, Ruben, you mentioned TSMC as an absolute pivot point, and absolutely it is. It's a crossover between, TSMC builds over 90% of the world's most advanced silicon. It sits in Taiwan. There's obvious issues about sovereignty in Taiwan and China's desire for one nation state. And yet the entire world is dependent on TSMC silicon supply. So there's this real tension, there's a real pivot point, and we see that expressed in silicon supply chain right now. Just a quick word on when I think we'll come out of it. Taiwan and TSMC, that's going to remain a pivot point for some time, and until Intel and other foundries get set up in Arizona, which will take several years, it's going to continue to be a real stone in the shoe. In general, we think supply chain will return to near normal levels by the end of next calendar year, but will remain difficult for a while. At that point, I'm expecting a huge capital crunch to hit. All these NCNR orders will be fulfilled. The vendors will want their money, and a lot of people who have been making very big bets are going to have to find capital to fulfill.
Stuart, that's terrific. I wonder, there's a question in the chat that sort of picks up on something that I was going to ask you anyway, so maybe I'll go to that. It's from, it doesn't have a name next to it, but and Anna, I'd be interested in your response to this too. And that is, I mean, do you have a sense of whether the broader New Zealand tech industry and government are sort of across these issues and planning for some of these different perspectives and different possibilities?
Yeah, I think when we look at, especially when we look at US export control, which is tangentially aligned, we see US export control is very explicit about where you can and can't sell. It's very and it specifically specifies companies that you can't sell to, individuals you can't sell to. There's a lot more engagement from government in the US about how enterprise should work and how it should sell and how it should purchase. I think in the past, New Zealand has had a much more generic hands-off approach to export policy and supply chain. But I think the world's becoming more difficult. And I think together with industry and government, we're going to have to be a bit more sophisticated than we have been.
Anna, do you want to offer any comments on that?
Yeah, look, I particularly see it in our industry because the majority of the companies in New Zealand at the moment are New Zealand US ventures, whether it be Rocket Lab or Whisk or whoever it is. And we are, under export controls, US export controls. So we are heavily regulated on terms of who we can deal with and how we deal with them. And so to a certain extent, just to answer your question, I think it's patchy. I think depends on your exposure to that divide. I think in our industry, we're very aware of it, and different companies are approaching it in different ways. A number of the European companies are actually taking a dual strategy, whereas the American companies tend to be taking a more of a singular focus on the US-led bloc. So I think there is a lot to be done in this area in terms of getting people prepared, or at least making deliberative choices. And understanding that rather than it just evolving, which is what it feels a little bit like at the moment. I mean, I would pick up on, the comment around silicon. Lithium is the other one. These raw materials that actually serve such an important part of electric aviation, around aerospace, around, e-cars, e-vehicles. They are very... those supply chains around those raw materials are actually quite critical. And so even from a New Zealand government perspective, having an opinion, having an approach to how we deal with that internationally. Cobalt is the other one. So these are raw materials that are absolutely crucial to the future of technology, of the planet, and we must have some sort of opinion about how they are going to be managed in the future.
Great, thank you. And hopefully, I guess this paper that Ruben's put together
Absolutely.
with Council's way of trying to generate some conversation around that. I wonder if I can just pick up and put this maybe a broader question, maybe perhaps to Ainiki, and Ruben, feel free to jump in if you want. It's a question from Jeremy Moses in the Q&A, which I think picks up on some of these extraction issues and supply chain issues that Anna was referring to around critical minerals, strategic minerals. And Jeremy says, in the worst case scenario that Ruben portrays, that sort of sees the emergence of two parallel tech supply chains, which would require massive increases in extraction, which would increase carbon emissions and intensify environmental costs. Obviously, the Biden administration has also put a lot of emphasis on climate in its diplomacy. How much influence does climate environmental issues, if any, play in some of the calculations, the thinking around decoupling? And I'll start with you, Ainiki, but if there are others that have a view on this, Anna, I know decarbonising is a big part of your business as well, so please jump in.
I would say the short answer is certainly not enough. And I would just point to Arizona as the case there. You want to fabricate semiconductors, but it's in a desert, and for something that might require some amount of water, it seems perhaps not to be indicative of an environmentally friendly approach. I think in the national security world here, thinking about climate change has largely been centered on what should a response to it look like. For instance, how droughts might impact conflict in certain places if there are food shortages, or what sea level rise may mean for naval operations. I would also point out that the state of rare earth extraction currently is not extraordinarily clean as it stands. And so, certainly there would be challenges going forward, but I think perhaps the upside is that at least they'll be more visible, and that might actually drive more investments in cleaner ways of doing it. But perhaps that's an optimistic way of looking at it.
Thank you, Aniki. Did anyone else want to jump in on that? Or
I'll just quickly say, I mean,
sure.
I don't have much to share, but this is the fundamental paradox of the age, isn't it? We have these growth-led economies, we have these short election cycles. Take the Biden administration, getting hammered in polling right now. I mean, there's a range of reasons for why that is the case. But you have things like inflation biting. So someone like Biden has to try and manage, okay, how do I get the economy booming to restore my polling numbers? At the same time, I have a massive flank of the Democratic Party that are putting pressure on me to enact environmentally friendly policies that could very well slow the economy, even though if eventually it recalibrates to something better in the long run. So I think domestic politics intervenes a lot here. There's a lot of big talk about the environment and the need to make real change, which I think all of us would agree on this score that it needs to be done. But at the same time, so many of our politicians are just driven by short-term calculations of re-election. So it's a real concern. It's a real paradox.
Thanks, Ruben. I wonder if I can just ask, somebody else has asked about the sort of time dimension here. Stuart, I think you've painted a pretty vivid picture of that intersection between demand and COVID, plus some of the regulatory and geopolitical tensions we're seeing playing out right now in terms of your supply chains and the delays that are already being felt, the need to think for being able to order over the horizon further ahead. These kind of scenarios, this disconnection that we're talking about here, and maybe Aniki, this is from a regulatory point of view, from a US point of view, this is one for you as well. How quickly do you see these things shifting dramatically? Is this something, this sort of disconnection that's likely to play out? Is this months? Is this years? Or is this something that, for some of the more dramatic disconnections, we're not going to see for a decade or so?
Once we get more diversity in the silicon fabrication, I mean, one of the issues is that we're so dependent on that one fab. And I know I keep talking about TSMC, there's a very good reason. It's one fabrication company based in Taiwan that over 90% of the advanced silicon comes out of. Anything from Apple or Nvidia or Samsung, it's like, that's where it comes from. And that makes it such a strong pivot point. I think once we do get diversity in the silicon fabrication supply chain, then a lot of these pressures just decouple. But that will take years for good yields to come out of new foundries. They're huge investments. Until then, it's going to be tricky. Personally, I'm hopeful. I think a lot of the pressure is going to come off supply chain, and hopefully the US and China can come to a bit more of a rational agreement. But it's still going to be a pivot point, and I think it's a matter of managing those relationships around Taiwan until diversity comes into the system. So yeah, good luck. It's tricky. It's tricky.
I agree with Stuart's point. For technologies like semiconductors, years takes huge amount of capital, expertise, and obviously there's the material component as well. I think there are a lot of things happening now and in the near term as well. And I think some of those things are happening even regardless of any US regulation. For instance, you're seeing a lot of technology companies starting to pull out of China just because the environment is so challenging for what kind of content can you put on your platforms? How do you have to store your data? So we've seen some moves there from Yahoo or from LinkedIn pulling out, or even, one of my favorite examples, not even the tech sector, is looking at some of the challenges Disney has had following the release of Mulan and some of the press coverage on, the Xinjiang security institutions. And so given those things, I'm pretty pessimistic about what decoupling looks like, but also insist that it's not totally driven by, the competition between the two countries. I think a lot of it is what China's doing even just domestically.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, we often portray this as a very binary competition. Generally speaking, I mean, I'm curious to get a sense from all of the presenters how much of that is an artificial representation. But if Aniki, I just follow up. I mean, I was looking at a conference in Taiwan that's coming up over the next few days, and there was the phrase I saw mentioned I hadn't seen before was the need to create democratic supply chains. And I wondered how much of this is about US-China disconnect, and how much of it is about liberal, democratic supply chains where you can have more confidence in the way that data is going to be managed, for example, or how much of this is about strategic competition that actually involves, from a US point of view, engaging with partners that might not tick all of those boxes in terms of being liberal democracies, but are valuable partners in terms of that broader competitive relationship.
Yes, that's a great question, and I suppose both. And so looking at, what does a democratic supply chain look like, perhaps then looking at democracies as suppliers, rather than the inverse, which is, I think, what usually comes to mind. And so when we think about networking equipment, for instance, are those going into, smart city projects in China and other nations as well? And so perhaps thinking about, do we want our private sectors feeding into these sort of abuses of technologies against human rights? That's one thing. I think perhaps looking at the other way, the way democracies source technologies, I think is somewhat about values. For instance, looking at labor practices in the production of certain materials. So that's one component, but I think it's more about what does free and open market competition look like? And so when you're seeing one nation state sort of upending what it means for private industry to even be able to compete on, free and fair footing, I think that's the other component as well. And so that one is less values-based in the normative governance sense, but more just about, capitalism, I suppose, at the end of the day. And if those are the conditions we want, how do we maintain that playing field?
Terrific, thank you. We're focused here on a lot on US regulation, but obviously there are two sides to the Pacific. And Anna, you talked about, some of these questions about regulation and certification. To what extent are we seeing China start to, can you tell us about the way that that rule setting and attempts to set new frameworks from a Chinese perspective is also playing out in the way that industry is thinking about these questions?
Yeah, look, I think from a advanced air mobility's perspective, what we're seeing is, and particularly in the sort of the uncrewed areas, so, drones and autonomous aircraft, is that the Chinese government are very interested in it. DJI is obviously a massive contributor to the to the global drone industry, but also EHang, which is the sort of the Chinese company equivalent of Whisk or Lilium or Volocopter, some of the bigger companies in the space. They are government backed. They have a very, very different certification process. Whereas we would be talking more, we talk a lot about social license. So we don't, have full visibility of what's going on with EHang, but, we spend up to 2 years just working with communities before we even start talking about where we might be actually going. That's quite a different approach. So what we're observing is there's just a fundamental difference in not only the regulation and the standards and the certification of these aircraft, but the approach that's being taken with communities. And so where that's going to meet in the middle, I couldn't necessarily say right now. Whether those, for example, EHang does have some, fantastic, cooperation agreements with various European and other jurisdictions. So they're obviously making headway, but their approach is quite different. So this comes back to the sort of need for an international approach. Also seeing this in aerospace, obviously with the regulation of aerospace, there is no regulation really in our space at the moment. So it's just starting in that area, and that's going to be fundamental to the future of the planet as to how we actually manage the space as well. So I think there's more questions than there are answers right now. It is right at the sort of starting at that, you know, in that conversation. And, you know, what we're observing is that there's quite some really big fundamental differences in approach that need to be navigated.
Fantastic, thank you. And you said there's more questions than answers. There's certainly lots of questions coming in too on the Q&A and the chat. So I wonder, I've got one here from Andy Prow, which I think I'll put to the whole panel. And he says, so true decoupling in the scenario 3, the starkest scenario that Ruben's painted. He says it'll be very hard to manage. For example, the provenance of technology. How do you prove tech is from China or not? What about things like off-the-shelf and embedded components? Is there, I mean, we know all of these rule of origin debates with inside trade agreements. What makes something from China? Does software run into these kinds of issues as well? Tech investments, is that something that's also being debated? He's got a big question at the end, which I think is I mean, do you think a kind of that starkest scenario is a full tech, a complete decoupling in this space in the long term really possible?
I'm happy to go just quickly.
Please.
I mean, the scenarios are broad types. The world is much messier than any scenario will ever be able to fully reflect, I think. I'll go for the final bit. I mean, is it possible? If I put on my Machiavellian strategist hat, I could imagine, depending upon how the US-China competition plays out, let's say some of these flashpoints over Taiwan do end up exploding in the coming years and relations really deteriorate and it looks like a Cold War kind of existential competition. Could the Americans simply conclude, look, we have to basically lock off part of the world from China because by engaging in this big international economic system with them, we relatively empower them over time. Therefore, we have to really double, triple, quadruple down on the kind of Cold War narrative, if you will. We have to lock up our global sphere of influence, such as it is, from whatever a China sphere of influence is. And then we get a kind of Soviet Union, United States, two worlds racing to see who will win, who can outlast the other. I don't think it's impossible. I think it's unlikely because I think the world is too messy. And I think hopefully we've learned enough from the Cold War that we're not going to get back to that point. But history is unpredictable. The future is unpredictable. There could be a series of events and developments in coming years that really deepen the fissures and lead both these nations to really drive us down into a situation of, hey, it's a race now, and we're going to lock you away. You know, both sides are going to try and lock up their spheres of influence. Not impossible, very unlikely, but that's just taking a 1,000-foot view of it.
Stuart, can I, just before Aniki comes, can I ask you, because you kind of hinted at this in your comments, you said, look, hopefully the supply chain will ease up, the pressures around the supply chain as COVID sort of starts to hopefully at some point recede. And you made that comment about, and the US and China will work things out. Where do you come down on this?
I think they have to. It's never about what's best or what's worst. It's always about what the alternatives are, and that will usually win out at the end of the day. And I think that's the case. I think as with every boom and bust cycle, the bust cycle exposes the weaknesses in the system, and the monopoly in the supply chain and the verging on chaos in the logistics supply chain have been exposed by COVID. I think, and we talk about getting more and more optimization in the system, I think you also need diversity in the system as well. So I think once we start to get alternate foundries, once we start to build in some redundancy in the logistics supply chain as well, I think the opportunity for the two sides to fight will diminish overnight. You know, people fight over scarcity. So I think it's going to take a little while, but I'm optimistic that once a bit of diversity and once a bit of extra capacity is put in place, that things will just naturally de-escalate, personally.
Thanks, Stuart. Aniki, I want to give you a chance to respond. And I just wonder if I can tack on just another question that somebody's asked. I mean, apart from this question of, is it possible? if there is a movement towards, even if it's not scenario 3, even if it's more of an intensification, how will the US actually assess whether or not this strategy is actually working? What does good progress look like in this sort of space?
I think on the US side, there's a lot of feeling out about what is national security and what is economic security. And I think the answers to those questions will determine what roads decoupling takes in particular areas. I don't think we're going to see a massive cleavage, the hemispheres, depart, the moon comes through the center, and so on and so forth. I don't envision a Cold War scenario, especially because it would be a Pyrrhic victory, right? I mean, even if the US secures certain supply chains that are national security interests, if we sort of nuke our own economic security interests while we do it, that's bad for everyone, everywhere. But I did want to pull some of the threads and some of the other questions in this question. I think one of them was on software, which is an interesting case, looking especially at, say, solar winds. There's been this question of the increasing use of software supply chain operations to get into US networks. And so the provenance of pieces of software is important to track. That being said, I don't think it's going to be a full-on walling off US software from other places, but certainly a cybersecurity hazard that's really specific. And I think, a narrow issue that will be tackled in its own way. And I think, let's see. And then in terms of sorry?
So please carry on. One of the other ones was investment was another one of the
Oh,
areas.
yes. Investments is an area of concern, at least here in the US, because the idea is that, foreign investments into companies can then also lead to influence on those companies. And then so from there, I think deciding, again, economic and national security interests for those particular technology companies. And then very briefly, I want to talk about the US as a source for technologies in the supply chain as well. There's growing interest in figuring out how to identify who is the ultimate end user of a technology, given China's military civil fusion strategy and use of shell companies. There's certainly an interest not to stop exporting everything, obviously, but just to make sure that it's not going to the PLA, which I think is a pretty well-defined and clear security interest.
Great, thank you. I want to, we're close to running out of time, but it's flown by. Seeing a focus of this is obviously New Zealand, where New Zealand fits into this more challenging environment. I wonder if I could just put a question to Stuart and Anna to close things out, and that is, you talked about being more vocal, having more of a conversation around these issues, but in terms of what you would like to see New Zealand government actors doing, and New Zealand doing, perhaps in terms of its relationships with either the United States or possibly with China and some of the issues around Taiwan, for example. What would you like to see done? What are the steps? What are the guidance, the policies that you'd like to see put in place that you think would be helpful?
I think from our perspective, what we'd like to see is just that regulatory, cooperation across different jurisdictions. So at the moment, obviously the FAA, New Zealand Civil Aviation Authority, Australian Civil Aviation Authority, UK and Canada work very closely together. You can probably work out why. And so, just to be able to expand that out so that the cooperation through international fora that already exist actually are developing the standards and regulations that can apply across all jurisdictions. And I think then the other thing is to look at some of those, fora like APEC, which I see Gray has mentioned, in his question. Yes, I think APEC, these international fora are really, really crucial for having those conversations, and we need to lean into that. New Zealand is actually showing itself to have some real advantages in particular industries, particularly high tech, if we want to continue to do that well, and to continue to be able to push that out globally, wherever it may be, then we do need to be active in putting our opinion forward.
Great, thanks, Anna. Stuart.
Yeah, I completely agree with Anna. The more the world entities align on certification and policy, the easier it's going to be to kind of democratize the supply chain. So I completely agree about certification. Unfortunately, it's kind of reversed in the last few years. Even UAE has got their own certification policies rather than aligning with Europe, for example. It's like that just makes it harder to do business. So I completely agree on alignment across the globe. That can only make things better. I think one of the difficulties we have in New Zealand is that we have such a dependence on China as a market from a primary industry point of view, and yet these technology businesses, especially around cyber and supply chain, force us to discuss uncomfortable issues such as Five Eyes and Taiwan. I think we have to learn to embrace the ugly bits more actively and not suppress discussion. And that because we have to be much more aware of the realities in the world, we have to find a way of doing that without disturbing primary supply chain as well. Because the fact of the matter is that we are part of the global economy in many ways other than primary, and we have to engage in aligning with entities which are in our favour.
Well, Stuart, thanks very much. And I see that I've already gone slightly past my my instructions from Jordan. The time has flown by, and I think it speaks both to the multiple layers that are sort of woven through this issue, the complexities, but also to the four terrific speakers we've had. So I'm very grateful to you for sharing analytic perspectives, but also those very, very experiential, those very practical perspectives of how this, what sometimes seems like quite an abstract concept, is playing out in supply chains and for your businesses, Anna and Stuart. It's been a real pleasure for me to have the chance to speak with you. Thank you so much. And I'm going to hand back now to Jordan to close things off.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Great job keeping things ticking over. Some fantastic questions to keep the conversation going. And most importantly, you kept it to time. Thank you very much. To our panel of experts, there's so much to take away from the discussion here. So I really thank you for sharing your expertise and experiences. And of course, to all of those who tuned in today and those who participated through comments and questions. We got to most of those. There's a few we weren't able to get to, and I noticed there's still more messages coming in. But I will do a wrap-up email after this, so probably on Monday with the recorded conversation, and perhaps I'll look at some of those questions as well. I think what's clear from the discussion is this process of decoupling is happening, and it's happening right now. And for New Zealand, we need to ensure for our future that we have access to and a choice of those critical technologies that supply is secure and it's reliable and it's cost effective. For New Zealand, we need to ensure we are a trusted partner for research and development and investment. We're part of those global innovation ecosystems. And you know, maybe scenario 3, Reuben, scenario 3 isn't a real possibility, but we need to be planning towards a range of different scenarios and having the discussion that Stuart talked about, and everyone talked about actually. So I think that's some of the challenge from here, and we need to keep that conversation going, and we need to get to that point of that end point of secure, cost-effective supply chains. I welcome all of your thoughts on that and how we can take this forward. Thanks again for tuning in. Thank you, David, and our panel. And finally, wish you all a happy and safe Christmas and New Year holiday season. Thank you.
Yes. Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Jordan.